Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the University of Hull's Inspired in Hull alumni podcast, where we meet some of our inspiring, interesting, and just great alumni who come back on campus and tell us a little bit more about themselves. Today we are visited by Robbie Hawkins, who is an executive producer for Tom Swarbrick's show on LBC Radio. He graduated in 2015 with a degree in politics and history. And today we are in the studio at Jam Radio, bringing Robbie back to his roots where it all started for him in student radio. Robbie, you were involved in radio as a student. How does it feel to be back in the studio today?
It feels amazing. I mean, it's just so different to how it was when I was there. When we were here, it was like a little broom cupboard that we had all of the kit that we could beg, steal and borrow. And now this is like an actually professional looking. I've been in professional studios that look worse than this. So it's great to be back and great to see that Jam's doing really well.
It's been really good to have you on campus today. And you did a session with some students just talking about careers in radio. And a huge part of that sort of conversation seemed to revolve around the subject of kitchen utensils. I was just wondering, because you work obviously in talk radio, you were using it as an example of how sort of a discussion in the studio can lead to the content that we listen to. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about how you created that sort of?
So, I mean, this idea was, I accidentally inspired a phone-in topic on Radio 2 about 6 months ago because I was at my grandma's house, who was also a former Hull student, so we can talk a bit more about that later. But we were just sorting through her kitchen utensils and we came across this grater, and my mum was there and she was like, "Is that the grater we had?" And my grandma was like, "Oh yeah, I think it's probably about 20 years old." And eventually we talked about it a bit more. My mum was like, "No, I remember growing up in Hull and that was our cheese grater." So we worked out that this cheese grater was about 50 years old. Anyway, I tweeted a picture of it. The producer of Jeremy Vine's program on Radio 2 follows me on Twitter and basically just DM me being like, "Yeah, we're doing a phone in on this now." And yeah, inspired an hour of talk, a phone in on Radio 2.
Is that something that maybe people wanting to get involved in radio can think about, like what other items they might find around the house?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's a make or break thing, depending on how old your grater is. But I think thinking about how you can create a discussion topic off a maybe something that you might see as a relatively mundane item, or something that is trying to make the things that might seem uninteresting, making them interesting. And I think that's a really useful skill.
I think you've got to be like a sort of expert in that, haven't you? Because like you're now currently the executive producer for LBC's, I guess, prime time show, the show when everyone's listening, and you're responsible for making sure that there's engaging content that people want to listen to and people want to talk about. What sort of pressure or creative sort of influences do you sort of feel about that?
I mean, there is an element of pressure to it, but to be honest, it feels like much more of a privilege. I started off, doing student radio, making radio shows that nobody listened to. And I've worked my way up through, to get to bigger and bigger platforms. And, as soon as I started working in radio, I knew that it was what I wanted to do. And actually, when I have a good day and I get home from work and I'm just like, actually, I'm living the dream. I'm doing my dream job. And to do that, to do a job that doesn't feel like work a lot of the time, to do that thing that, even if I wasn't working in radio, I'd be wanting to have a radio show. I'm so into radio that I've just started doing a music radio show as well that I just do unpaid on a weekend just for the pure enjoyment of it. So to actually, although it has that big audience with it and that has an element of pressure, there is a real privilege that comes with it too. And it means that actually there's an element of influence that you have, and that, the question that you can ask the Prime Minister or that politician can be the thing that shifts the dial. I always think about when, so it was a couple of years ago on the day of the budget when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor of the Exchequer, we managed to get him to come on and basically take calls from listeners about what had been announced in the budget. And this was the beginning of the time when sort of Rishi Sunak had just been introduced to the electorate. He was sort of seen as the likely successor to Boris Johnson, but it wasn't necessarily a given. And I remember we had a call on from a woman who she was saying that she was a university educated woman. She was, from a self-described like middle class background, but she was saying she was having to work 2 jobs so that she could afford to like feed her kids and heat her house and everything. And we had her on basically putting her situation to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he basically couldn't handle it. And there was this bit of a moment where it felt like actually maybe that's the beginning when the shine came off Rishi Sunak a little bit. He was sort of seen as the golden boy at this point. Everyone only really recognised him for being the person who introduced furlough during the pandemic, and they'd never really seen any negative. And then this was the first time where maybe he had been put in touch with an ordinary person, and there was started to be questions asked. And, you know, without wanting to blow our own trumpet too much, I think that was a contributing factor to when it came to the leadership election between him and Liz Truss. I think if something like that hadn't happened, then it wouldn't have been such a clear victory for Liz Truss. And obviously we're where we are now. But I think maybe things could have been slightly different. And having that opportunity to create something that reveals the truth about someone or about a politician is just such a privilege and an honour to be able to do, really.
I think it's really interesting that you've picked that that sort of example as well, because one of the things I thought was really interesting about the session you did with the students, it was called How the News is Reported. And your career has sort of seen you actually with the BBC, where you were reporting events in Parliament on the live blog. So sort of very much where it's happening and relating it back to people. Whereas now in your career, you're on talk radio, and actually it's not just that you're reporting the news. Often the news is happening right there on your show. Yeah,
I think that's the big thing, is that actually news is people's lives. And a lot of the time, although things might be getting reported and there is an element of following what other people are telling you, actually, if you're listening to ordinary people, and that's the privilege that we have on LBC, is that we have ordinary people who are wanting to give up their time. You know, they're pulling over the car so they can phone into a radio station. They might be waiting on hold so they can get on air to tell us their story and how this story impacts them and what they think about it. And I think that is just, it's a brilliant thing. And, you know, even if I in future don't work for LBC anymore, I know that I'll keep listening to it because it gives you such an insight into actually what stories are impacting people's lives. You might be thinking like a lot of the stuff we hear about how Westminster is covered, you know, how this big vote is going to impact the Prime Minister, how it's going to bring down the government, actually day to day doesn't impact people's lives that much. But actually hearing about, you know, that thing that might seem like relatively minor, you know, the cost of driving lessons and how that's impacting people's lives, or how local bus services are getting cut, stuff like that. Although it might seem reasonably, you know, trivial, actually you can really learn how much of an impact it's having, and that's a real privilege.
I think, it does sound like a really real privilege. And you mentioned as well earlier on today when we were talking about how, you know, because you work in talk radio, you can often see those sort of political trends as they're emerging. So I think you said because you were, anyone who worked in talk radio knew that the Brexit vote was going to come with Brexit.
Yeah.
And anyone who works in talk radio knows that the Tories are going to lose the next election. Are there any other sort of trends emerging, do you think, that you can predict?
I mean, it's you can never say with absolute confidence. Like, I mean, even at the same time, I think anyone who's listened to enough phone-in radio and who's worked in that space and is engaging with ordinary people would know that I think there's a bit of a feeling that time is up for this government. I think I also wouldn't be surprised if maybe that victory for Labour isn't as big as some people are predicting it could be, because also whilst there is no enthusiasm for this government, there's not a lot of enthusiasm for the Labour Party as it is either. So I think there is maybe an element of actually we're expecting this Labour landslide, but actually, you know, maybe it might be not quite as big as we're expecting.
One of the things that I think that like probably characterizes our politics today is how divisive things are and how, you know, it's hard to have that conversation that bridges the divide. Historically, when you were on campus, you were a very, say, left-wing student. You're working for, currently you're working with Tom Swarbrick, who's got a conservative background. You also worked with Ian Dale as well, who is a conservative. How for you personally do you bridge that divide or handle that sort of divisiveness in our politics?
I mean, I in a way almost would rather work with someone that I disagree with than work with someone that I do agree with, because I think you can become too echo chamber and you don't open yourself up to outside influences. And although, you know, I was a pretty radical student activist, I'm definitely less so now. I think I'm definitely less radical. And although, you know, I have my views, there is an element too with being a producer isn't about your opinion. It's about getting the best out of the presenter. And if my opinion was that important on this political issue, then I'd be the one presenting the programme. And it's about recognising actually what your role is in that. So my job is to get the best out of that presenter. And that might mean actually if we're about to go into something and we want to make a really fiery, engaging, exciting program in which we're talking about the big political issue of the day, and this presenter is, going to go in all guns blazing and say what they think about it, I want to almost get them riled up too. So actually, if we were on the same side of the debate the whole time, there would be a bit of a feeling that actually, we maybe wouldn't be open to those influences. I think there's sometimes a case where if you have a certain view, you only really want to hear from people that you also agree with. And it's really important as part of a production team that you have that range of views, because, presenter might be tired of talking to someone that they disagree with, because it is more exhausting having those conversations, but they're really important. And actually, no one has ever changed their mind as a result of being shouted at. They've changed their mind because someone is making the trouble to understand their position, and then they have adjusted their arguments accordingly. And that's the really important thing about it. And although, I'm not the one who is broadcasting my opinion, there is an element of, I might feel a certain way about an issue. I can speak to the presenter. We can have this conversation off air. And actually, by having that dialogue and that discussion, then we can find a way that actually, is something that we both agree with. And that's what it's all about. It's about listening to other people and learning from them and adjusting the way you think. No one should have that rigid sort of dogma that they follow. You should have that open-minded approach. And that's, I think, a really great opportunity to do that and do my job.
That's really interesting. And what you were saying earlier about like it being a privilege to work on radio, it made me think, you were mentioning earlier that in your first job in radio, you were waking up at 2 a.m. or you had to start work at 2 a.m.
Yeah, so my taxi would. This was actually my second job, so this was kind of a promotion. So I was producing the early breakfast show on BBC Radio London, and the show started at 4 a.m. So I had to get in at 3 so we could go through all the newspapers and work out what stories we were going to talk about. And this was in London, and I wasn't earning enough to live very close to the station. So my taxi would pick me up at 2:15 in the morning, drive me to the station. So it'd be a 45-minute walk. I was lucky enough that that they were offering a taxi in. And starting at 2 and finishing at 11 a.m.
I mean, because recently one of our graduates, James Graham, the playwright, was on Desert Island Discs, and he was talking about like how he was actually diagnosed as a workaholic. And then obviously to meet you and hear like your stories of being at work and how you're working for free and stuff, I wondered, are you a workaholic?
I think I probably am. I think there's definitely an element of it. I think in recent years, over COVID, I had to learn to readjust a little bit. And there is an element of working in news that, it's always changing. There's always something going on. And if you're a real news junkie, which I am, it's really hard to switch off. But also it's incredibly mentally draining. And, I'll admit there are times when there's a big international crisis going on and it gets to the end of the week and I'm sat watching the 10 o'clock news and it comes off air and I just sit there and I just cry, and it's just completely burns you out. And there is an element you have to learn how to switch off. So on weekends, I try to take breaks from it, mentioned that I started doing a music show. That's a sort of a light relief. And I don't really like sitting still, but I try and find other ways of doing it that isn't just watching the news all of the time or doing something work related.
Yeah. I mean, how does it feel, when a big news story breaks? Because you've been working when Trump was elected, when Brexit happened, when the 2017 election surprise result came out, when Grenfell happened. So you've been working as some of the biggest stories of recent years have actually been breaking. What's going through your mind when that happens?
Well, it's terrifying. Like I don't think it doesn't get any less terrifying. And if you're not scared by a story like that, because it's a huge amount of responsibility, if you were listening, you would want whoever you're listening to be giving you the correct information. And obviously you want to get that information out there quickly so people are informed, but you've got to make sure it's right. So there's that responsibility. You're also thinking about, maybe someone is listening and they know people who live in that tower. Maybe that terrorist attack that's happened, maybe someone who's listening, a loved one, is in the area and they've not heard from them. And they're worrying about those things, and you're being very conscious that those scenarios are important to a lot of people in a lot of ways. And so it's terrifying, but it's also very exciting. And it's a bit of your adrenaline really goes, and I've never felt anything quite like it. It's such an adrenaline rush when you are you're just running hot, and you are literally just, it's all hands on deck. You know, you'll never see teamwork, like a newsroom coming together when there's a breaking news situation. You know, you might have been setting up for the next program or something going on the next day, but if there's a breaking news situation, it's all hands on deck. We need people to make sure that the output that we're doing at that time is, you know, unstoppable and brilliant and informative and important. And that is it's such a joy when you come off it and you feel like actually you've done a good job. And although those situations can feel very traumatic, you know, after Grenfell, for example, I had a lot of trouble sleeping for a while. And, you know, thankfully, like, I've worked at employers who they provide an element of mental health support for all of this stuff. Like, COVID was a very challenging time it was a challenging time for everyone, but I think people working in news found it really tough because, you know, we were technically key workers. We were going in, we were informing people on these stories, and we couldn't switch off from it. And that is the element of it too. So yeah, I keep saying it, but it's a privilege, but it's also, it's a pleasure. It's why you do the job. If you don't enjoy breaking news, you don't work in live radio.
One of the things I find like really interesting about you and your work is, like, you know, you, on the one hand, it's not just that you're in touch with your audience and you're receptive to, like, the audience, you know, when people are listening and engaging, but you're actually in a way speaking to them, or at least the presenter that you're working with is speaking directly to them. But at the same time, you're also speaking to the people on the other side of the news. Like you mentioned, the Prime Minister, and I think you mentioned you'd been in David Cameron's house recently. Like, how do you, like, sort of like balance that? You've got to present or give people the news via these important people in government, but also sort of, like, I guess, handle the public response as well.
I mean, that's the challenge, and that's something that I still think all of us, I don't think that's something that you necessarily ever completely crack. You know, maybe if you're political editor of the BBC, then, you know, maybe you get better at it. But there is always an element of, you know, that they're talking to you for a reason. They know that you're talking to them for a reason. But also, you know, I try to be nice to everyone. I try and be friendly to everyone. I try not to interact differently with people, whether I'm at work or whether I'm not at work. And I think that is a good approach to take, of just, you know, you can be genuine, you can be honest, you can be open. You don't need to trick people. And I think there is an element of people, you don't get to be the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom without understanding that this is how the media works as well. So there's always that sort of balancing act that is going on. But, you know, I'm lucky to work with people who've been doing this longer than I have. And the main, like, I've never had any formal journalism training. Everything I've learned from watching other people and listening to other people. And that is the real privilege of it, is that you get to learn from those people and you just sort of see what they do. And maybe there are times, you know, you mentioned when I went to David Cameron's house, I didn't speak the whole time I was there. I was there to press record, and I was there to watch and observe and to listen. And I was just there. I was there with Ian Dale. He did the interview. He, you know, made the small talk with him. I was just there for that. But it was such a learning experience at the same time, just to see how, you know, where else am I going to be in a situation where I get to come into contact with a Prime Minister or a former Prime Minister? And I think in that situation, all you can do is just sit and watch and learn. And I'm just lucky that I've had that opportunity to do that, really.
I think, like, maybe sometimes, like, from the outside, people see journalists and politicians and I guess, like, schmoozing or going in the same circles and stuff. But I mean, obviously as well, like, you've got to appear towards someone like David Cameron, like, you're going to treat his appearance on your show in good faith. Is there a game that has to be played to sort of build those relationships, but at the same time hold these people accountable?
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, you know, when we had David Cameron on, the reason we had him on was because he had a book coming out. You know, that's why he was doing media. And also, someone like David Cameron or a Gordon Brown or these people who've been at the very top, they only agree to do interviews when there's something that they want to say to get out of it, because they don't need to do any more than that. There are maybe sort of lower level people where you are finding that compromise. So last week, for example, I was producing an interview with Keir Starmer, and they were doing these interviews off the back of their big arts announcement that they were doing, which is obviously a very interesting thing to talk about. But there was a lot going on in politics as well that we wanted to hear from Starmer on. And they knew that we also wanted to talk about that. So it's about giving them the space to talk about the thing that they want to talk about. And in exchange, they know that we're going to then ask them about those sorts of things. it does occasionally happen, especially with, say, politicians who are a bit newer to it, who don't quite realise that that's kind of the game you have to play. I remember one time, and I'm not going to name names for obvious reasons, but we got an MP on to talk about a particular story, and we asked them off the back of it something that they'd said in the House of Commons that had been a bit controversial, and they answered the question. They carried on, and then at the end of the interview, once we'd stopped recording, they said to us, "You can't use that. You didn't tell me you were going to ask that." And we were like, "Well, that's not how it works. You've agreed to do the interview, therefore we have a right to ask whatever. You know, if you said at the beginning, I would do the interview on the understanding that you don't ask me about this, then we can then accommodate that. We wouldn't agree to do an interview on the understanding that we don't ask something, but you can say it. And if you want to set those things, then don't do the interview, and that's fine." Anyway, and we made that point to them, which they said, "Well, I don't think that's right. You can expect to hear from my lawyers." Anyway, 20 minutes later, we got a call from them and said, "Actually, I've spoken to my team. You can do that, whatever." And it was embarrassing for them, and that was just them not understanding how it all works. Within the media, we have a right to ask them anything, and quite often people say, "Oh, can you give us an idea of what questions you're going to ask?" It's like, well, no, because that's not. If you want a list of questions, then don't do the interview. That's the agreement that we make, and it's as simple as that, really.
So today you've come back to the University of Hull campus where it all began for you, and you made your grandmother cry.
So my grandparents met at the University of Hull. My granddad was president of the Students' Union. I think his claim to fame used to be that he poured the first pint ever poured in the Students' Union at the University of Hull. And they met through that. And then, after graduating and getting married and moving elsewhere, they eventually moved back to Hull. And my granddad ended up being, he headed up the careers service and then the international office. And my grandma was very involved with the university, ended up getting an honorary degree for her work that she was doing locally through social work. And it meant that my mum grew up right here. I support Hull City. And actually, that's part of the reason why I went to Hull. I had a couple of options to go to, and my dad basically said, "Oh, well, if you go to Hull, I'll buy you a season ticket." And after that, it was just like, well, there we go. And, it was really nice coming back today and just wandering around campus. And, I never thought I'd feel nostalgia for Doncaster train station, but just looking at over on those tracks and sort of looking back to, over 10 years ago now, nearly, that I was here. It was really nice. And again, just walking around and thinking about my granddad who passed away a few years ago now, and just called my grandma up and just thought I'd give you a call and let you know that I'm here, and I'm thinking about you and thinking about granddad. And it was really nice to come back.
I mean, that's really lovely because obviously I think there's a lot of people have that story of where the relationship to the university is one that goes through generations, and obviously the university must mean a lot to you and to your family. What are the experiences that you had on campus that mean a lot to you and that still sort of affect you today?
I think the big thing really is the student radio stuff. I did all right in my degree, and I enjoyed my degree, and I have definitely found it helpful. But actually, having that opportunity to do radio in an environment where you could make mistakes, you could try things out, you could I always say that actually student radio and a professional radio, they're not really that different. It's a microphone, it's someone talking, you might have some music, you're trying to make an entertaining program. That if you can work out a way of making an entertaining student radio program, you can make an entertaining professional radio program. And that was the big thing, really. And that's where I think all of my happiest memories at uni were in some way related to student radio, whether that's the socials that we put on, or doing our election coverage and interviewing the candidates for president and all of this other thing. And it's something I talk about all the time. And actually working in radio, it seems to be a thing that the number of people who never thought want to work in radio till they went to university got involved with a student radio station, and they were just, after that, they knew that was what they wanted to do.
On that note, I want to do something a little bit different that we've never done in a podcast before, which is hand over the reins to the current Jam Radio students to to
Great.
do a section of the interview. The old, not well, sorry, the modern and the historic. There's no good way of saying that.
Not too offended.
Thank you. Right, so what I was going to do is hand over to Tom Shoulder to do 10 minutes.
Cool. So what do you want me to say for this part?
So now you're doing the interview, mate.
I mean, the questions that I really have are more to do with how you sort of entered the world of work with it. How easy was it jumping from being a student into jumping into the world of, actual radio?
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge. I'm not gonna deny it. So I got into doing radio because I got to the end of my degree, did my last show on student radio, and was like, oh, I've not got a radio show anymore. What am I going to do now? And I hadn't really thought about it before then. So I applied for work experience at the BBC, and they release them every year. I think a couple of times a year, and I just put in an application for a few of them. Luckily got into one at BBC Radio Northampton, which is in my hometown. And it was 20 minutes up the road from where I was living with my mum and dad. Did that for a week. Disappeared off to Ghana for a few months to go and do a volunteering project. And I think I was very enthusiastic and very keen and said yes to everything, and offered everyone cups of tea, and they were getting me doing things like going out and vox popping people. It's just a news story that I've got this work experience person. Can we just go and ask them to go and ask a load of people in the town centre what they think about a certain issue? And coming back, and off the back of my experience from doing what was then Whole Fire Radio, now Jam, we'd done some vox popping around the union. So I'd had that bit of practice and sort of thinking about how can I make this sound good? How can I, ask the right question? So it's not just going to be like, do you like this? Yes.
Yeah.
What don't you like? But instead it's, what do you think of this? Or what can you do about this? And it's giving them the opportunity to give the expansive answers. So off the back of having that experience, go into my work experience, do that. And then I basically did a really good job of it, I think. And they ended up, playing it out loads, getting in bulletins. Even at one point, they were like, "Oh, Robbie, I know you were meant to be going home now, but we'd really like a Vox on this. Can you go and get us another one?" So I did that, and I think just from being enthusiastic and hardworking and going the extra mile and being willing to do that, and also showing that I knew what I was doing and that I wasn't scared of, picking up the phone and ringing someone, because that's a big thing, actually, that before I started working in radio, I didn't realise was such a thing. And I know it's a thing for a lot of younger people now. People are scared to use the phone, but the phone is such an important thing. Like, people can ignore a text message. If you ring someone up and say, "Hello, would you come on the radio and talk about this?" If you can get over that fear, then that makes a big difference. So I did the work experience, and then they basically said, "Oh, we've got a few shifts we need to fill over Christmas. Would you be interested in doing some?" I'd been back in the country, so they emailed me like about 2 days before I came back, and I went straight from the airport to the radio station. I'm not used to computer for 3 months, had some basic training on how to use these things, and then I had my first actual shift on Christmas Day. So I started doing that and basically just said yes to everything. Said yes to everything all the time. I got a job in a pub, so I had enough money to be able to pay my rent. So I was working full time in a pub and basically taking whatever shifts I could get. Thankfully, the pub were quite accommodating. I'd said to them, I'm doing this because I want to do this. And it meant that sometimes if I'd been offered a shift or someone had called in sick and they needed me to stick around for longer, the pub would be a little bit more understanding. And it was difficult. I remember one time having a full day at work at the radio station till about 7:00, going straight to the pub, doing a shift until 2 a.m, getting home, sleeping for about an hour, getting in and producing the breakfast show on the Saturday morning, which started at 6. So did that. Someone called in sick when I was there, and I had to stick around till 6 p.m, had an hour off, went to the pub, did my Saturday night shift, was there till 2 a.m, got home, found that my sister had locked me out of the house, had to climb in through her bedroom window, then get up the next morning and go and do another morning shift at the radio station. And I was working non-stop. I was exhausted, but I was doing what I loved. I was doing radio. And that's what you've got to do. You make yourself irreplaceable, and you show that you're keen, you show that you're willing to do that. And that's basically what it is. You got to be a bit of a nuisance sometimes. I was all prepared I was lucky in that after doing work experience, they came to me and said, "Oh, would you want to come and do this?" But I was all prepared to start harassing them, being like, "Really enjoyed when I came in before. Can I come in again and just, watch and make tea and whatever?" And basically just being around and, being available. When I was at Hull, I was doing a bit of stuff with BBC Humberside. I started off just going and watching their BBC introducing sessions go out, and then started doing occasionally bits of interviews from gigs and offering that to them. And then I was here for the 2015 general election. They wanted a runner. They said they wanted a runner. Basically, they just wanted to try and find some new people, and they got me to do that. And I just sort of went around and spoke to a few sort of wannabe politicians that didn't really win any votes, and they used it on the programme. And it's just sort of being available, introducing yourself to people, being keen, because it's an industry that always needs people. People move around a lot. With it being freelance, sometimes people might spend ages freelancing and then get offered a job somewhere else, and all of a sudden that station is left without someone doing that job. If you're the person who 1 minute was making tea, but the person who previously was answering the phones has just gone to another job, they need someone to answer the phones. I know people there's a guy on LBC called Clive Bull. He's been a presenter on LBC for probably about 30, 40 years. He started off, he was the tech op. So he used to do the mics, he used to control all of that. One day the presenter didn't turn up, and someone had to present the program. So he started presenting the program. And that's the thing. If you get yourself in there and you show you're keen, you keep on going back. They might be like, "Oh, we haven't got any space for you at the moment." Then, just give them the opportunity, keep going back, show that you want to do it. That's the big thing.
Sort of wedge yourself in there.
Yeah. Make yourself hard to ignore. That's the best thing to do.
So that's your advice to students that are interested in a career in radio then?
Yeah, well, there's that, and also just get involved with your student radio station, because I can't push it more enough. It's such a good opportunity to think about how to make things. I remember listening to an interview with Greg James from Radio 1, and he was saying that COVID was great for him because all of the editors were all working from home, and it felt like being at a student radio station again, because there was no one there telling you what you couldn't do. So you could have those crazy ideas and you could take a bit of a gamble with it because there's no one there to tell you off. And that's what student radio is. You're messing around. There's no one there to tell you off. Maybe you're going to tell them off as station manager, but it's a bit different to the person who could sack you. You've got that space to do that thing that's a bit crazy. You might do a great show and still no one's listening. You might do a really bad show and still no one's listening. But you can still make a really engaging show. And even if that one person that is listening, they might really, really enjoy it. And that's great.
What sort of advice would you give to people that are still here and they want to make the most of their time? What sort of advice would you give to them? What should they prioritise?
A big sort of regret that I think I have from my time at uni is actually you don't spend that much time in lectures. And I spent a lot of time watching Netflix and playing Football Manager. And I did really good on Football Manager, but it's not done a lot for me, career-wise, or actually even, I wish I'd read more books. I wish I'd done more volunteering work. I wish I'd got like a part-time job. All of that stuff is all worthwhile doing. And that's what I really wish I'd done. And that can include the radio. I mean, I got pretty involved in radio. By the time I was in third year, I was on the exec. I did 3 radio shows a week and I was covering anyone that I could get it. I was doing that sort of stuff. But actually, I look back and I sort of think, I really didn't need to play so much Football Manager.
That's, yeah. I mean, I can agree with you. I mean, the amount of video games that I play now is quite,
Yeah, I mean, they're a nice use of time and there's space for them, but,
not that much space.
I probably don't need to stay up till 4 a.m. every night playing Football Manager.
No. In terms of career options afterwards, what would your advice be in terms of like areas that we should look into as student media people and sort of?
I mean, I actually think the thing that's worked for me is I've gone into it with an open mind and I've gone into it open to whatever opportunities came up. When I was at Hull, when I was doing student radio, all of the shows that I did were music shows. And when I decided I wanted to work in radio, I wanted to work in music radio. But then I worked in local radio and I didn't like any of the music that was being played. And actually working in music radio where you don't like any of the music is really boring. But the great thing about local radio is you were also working on the news teams and news was really exciting. I'd done politics and history. It was a really good opportunity to, put that interest that I had to use. And that came about as a result of just being open and willing, Some people say, oh yeah, I'd like to be a radio journalist. I really like Formula One. I really want to cover Formula One. It's like, well, great, you can do that. But start off by doing whatever you can. You know, I don't know a huge amount about football. I know a little bit about football. If I had sort of carried on the way I was going, I could have ended up being the Northampton Town reporter for BBC Radio Northampton, because I was saying yes to stuff whenever they asked me to do it. I remember going down and interviewing Chris Wilder, who was the Northampton Town manager at the time. And they played one game and I absolutely butchered my question. So embarrassed. But, you know, it was fine. They didn't have anyone else to do the shift. So the next week when the reporter was off, they still sent me down again. It wasn't getting taken off. And, you know, it was enough for me to sort of be a bit like, okay, well, actually, maybe football reporting's not what I want to do. But, you know, you get into an organisation, say, like at the BBC, you can do anything. I went from working in local radio, doing phone-ins around, like, you know, parking in certain parts of London, to then going to BBC Parliament and covering debates that were going on about Brexit. And there are, just by keeping your options open, keeping open-minded, if you've got something you really want to do, by all means pursue it. And at times I found it difficult because I've never really had a clear idea about what I wanted to do, what my ultimate goal is. But actually having lots of interests and being open-minded to doing stuff was also a great opportunity, because it meant that I've got to do some really cool things.
Mm. And for people that are, you know, umming and ahhing, thinking about joining student radio or any form of student media, what would your advice be to them?
I mean, what else are you doing with your time? Because, you know, I can't think of something that was a better use of time for me at university. And, you know, obviously if you're studying loads, fair enough. You know, your degree is the most important thing at the end of the day. But, you know, if it's between joining student radio or, you know, some other society that actually, you know, in the long run, it's not going to do that much to help your career. I mean, Taylor Swift Society sounds great, but I'm not sure it's going to necessarily do you that much at the end of the day beyond meeting some nice people. And actually, you know, student radio is really good fun. You can be silly. You can be as serious as you want. You meet people. You get cool opportunities. It's amazing. I used to go to gigs all the time across Hull, and I'd just say, I'm with the student radio station. Can I come down? And I got to meet all of these people. You know, I got to interview these bands. I got free tickets. Sometimes you get free beers. You know, whatever thing is that you can get involved with at university, you get to do these great opportunities. So, you know, and there's no harm in trying. You know, you might do it for a term and decide it's not for you, but, you know, at least you tried it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. That answers every question that I have. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
So, Robbie, it's been great to have you back on campus. We're really grateful for you taking the time to speak to us and spending the time earlier on with some students, talking to them about working in the radio. Before we go, I just want to ask you one last question, and that's, what does it mean to you to be a graduate of the University of Hull?
I think it's a real point of pride, actually. Whether that's being in politics and the people that you come across who've also been to Hull, or, you know, when people say, oh, you went to Hull, I was always a bit snobby about Hull, and then I went up and I realised it's a really great place. And I think that's the big thing, really. It's being a Hull grad is actually, it definitely taught me to not just to judge a book by its cover. And actually, I think I've had a lot of amazing experiences from just sort of pushing through that initial, maybe slight skepticism from other people and, you know, giving it a try.
Thank you very much, Robbie. It's been
Cheers.
great to speak to you today.